You ever get that feeling like the room goes quiet the moment you walk in? Not respect, not fear, something else. Something colder. Like they've already decided who you are before you even speak. They watched you. Closely. Every move, every mistake. Every moment you thought nobody noticed. They built a case out of your struggles. Turned your pain into evidence. Your silence into suspicion. They asked around, dug deep. Questioned everyone who ever crossed your path. Frenemies. People who smiled in your face and people who couldn't stand you. And you know what's funny? Every single one of them said the same thing. Not because it was true, but because it was convenient. Because it's easier to label you than to understand you. Easier to call you broken than to admit you survived things they wouldn't last a day in. They don't investigate greatness. They investigate difference. And when they can't control it, they try to contain it. They wrote their reports, drew their conclusions, put you in a box with a name on it like they figured you out. But what they really did was expose how afraid they are of something they can't predict. They didn't just look at you, they studied you. Quietly, patiently, like you were some kind of case file waiting to be cracked open. Every step you took, every pause, every reaction, you thought it was just life happening. But to them, it was data, patterns, clues. They noticed the way you hesitated before speaking, like you were measuring the room before letting your words exist. They saw the moments you pulled back, chose silence over noise, distance over fake connection. To you, it was survival. To them, it was suspicious. Funny how that works. They weren't watching to understand you. They weren't trying to see what built you, what broke you, what forced you to become this version of yourself. No, they were watching with a conclusion already sitting in the back of their minds, just waiting for something, anything, to confirm it. And you gave them plenty. Not because you're weak, but because you're real. Because life doesn't shape people into clean, predictable patterns. It leaves scars, cracks, inconsistencies. And every time you showed one of those cracks, they leaned in closer, like they found gold. They saw you struggle and called it instability. They saw you question things and called it defiance. They saw you stand alone and called it isolation. They never once stopped to ask why. Because why takes effort. It takes empathy. It forces people to step outside their own small, comfortable perspective. And most people, they don't like doing that. It's easier to observe from a distance, to collect little moments and twist them into something that fits the story they already believe. So they kept watching, waiting for you to slip, waiting for you to react, waiting for that one moment where you'd prove them right. And when it happened, and it always happens, because you're human, they locked onto it like it was the only thing that ever mattered. That one mistake, that one reaction, that one moment of weakness. To them, that was you. Not the nights you fought battles nobody saw. Not the times you held yourself together when everything inside you was falling apart. Not the discipline it took just to keep going when quitting would have been easier. None of that made it into their observation, because they weren't looking for truth. They were looking for confirmation. They watched you through a lens they created, and everything you did passed through it. Distorted just enough to match their expectations. You could have done 100 things right, but they'd ignore 90. 9 just to focus on the one that fit their narrative. And the worst part, they think they're right. They believe their version of you is accurate. That their careful observation gave them insight, understanding, clarity. But all it really gave them was a reflection of their own limitations. Because when you watch someone without the intention to understand them, you don't see who they are. You see what you want to see. You see your fears, your biases, your assumptions projected onto someone who never even got the chance to explain themselves. Your pain didn't stay yours for long, it never does. The moment it showed on your face, slipped through your voice, or echoed in your actions, They took it. Not to help, not to understand, but to use it. They collected your worst moments like trophies. Every time you broke a little, every time life pushed you to the edge, and you reacted like any human would, they were watching, quietly adding it to their little collection of proof. You thought you were just going through something. They thought you were revealing something. Big difference. That night you couldn't hold it together evidence. That time you trusted the wrong person evidence. That moment you lost control, even for a second evidence. They didn't see context. They didn't see pressure, exhaustion, betrayal, or the weight you were carrying behind the scenes. All they saw was the outcome, the reaction, the visible crack in the surface. Because that's all they needed. Pain to them isn't something to respect. It's something to analyze, something to point at and say, see, that's who they really are. Like a single moment under pressure defines an entire existence. And the more you struggled, the more material you gave them. It's almost ironic. The things that should have earned you understanding became the very reasons they judged you. The nights you were barely holding on, the days you were running on nothing but willpower, the times you chose to keep going when quitting would have been easier. None of that mattered. Because pain doesn't look heroic from the outside. It looks messy, unpredictable, uncomfortable. And people hate uncomfortable. So instead of asking what pushed you there, they turned it into a label. Instead of recognizing strength in your survival, they framed it as weakness in your character. They simplified your entire story into a few broken moments they could easily understand. Or at least pretend to understand. They never asked what it took for you to get back up. They never cared about the parts you kept hidden, the restraint, the control, the internal battles you fought just to keep things from getting worse. That doesn't fit into their narrative, because their version of you needs to be simple, predictable, contained, and pain, real pain, doesn't fit neatly into boxes. So they forced it to. They took something deeply personal, something that shaped you, hardened you, taught you lessons they'll probably never learn, and reduced it to a few observations they could repeat to others like facts. Like they cracked the code, like they figured you out. But all they really did was misunderstand something they were never strong enough to experience themselves. Because pain changes people in ways you can't measure from the outside. It builds layers, defenses, instincts. It teaches you how to survive in environments that would break others completely. It forces you to adapt, to evolve, to become something sharper, more aware, more dangerous in a way they'll never fully grasp, and that scares them. So they take your pain and turn it into something smaller, something they can explain, categorize, and control in their minds. Because if they admit that your pain made you stronger, then they have to confront their own inability to endure it. So instead, they call it weakness. They call it instability. They call it proof. And they walk away convinced that your lowest moments define you, unaware that those same moments are the reason you became someone they could never be. It didn't matter who they asked. The answers always came back the same. Different faces, different voices, different histories with you. But somehow, the story never changed. Almost like it was rehearsed. They talked to people who barely knew you. People who only saw fragments of your life. Tiny glimpses that meant nothing without context. And somehow, those fragments turned into full conclusions. Bold statements. Confident judgments. He's like this. He always does that. That's just who they are. Funny how quickly, sometimes, becomes, always, when people are trying to define you. Then they went to the ones who knew you a little better. Friends, or at least people, who once stood close enough to see parts of the real you. But even there, the story didn't shift much. It just got polished, more convincing, more detailed. Like they added just enough truth to make the lie believable. Because that's the trick, isn't it? You don't build a strong narrative out of pure fiction. You take pieces of reality, twist them slightly, remove the parts that don't fit, and suddenly, you've got something everyone can agree on. And that's exactly what happened. Every witness brought their own bias, their own experience, their own version of events shaped by how they felt about you, what they expected from you, or what they couldn't understand about you. And instead of those differences creating a fuller picture, they all somehow aligned. Not because you're that simple, but because people tend to echo what's already been said. One person calls you difficult. The next one starts seeing difficulty everywhere. One person labels you distant. Suddenly every quiet moment becomes proof of detachment. It spreads, quietly, subtly, like an idea that grows stronger the more it's repeated. And before you know it, it becomes truth. Not actual truth, but accepted truth. The kind nobody questions anymore. They didn't compare notes to understand you better. They compared notes to validate what they already believed. Every matching statement wasn't seen as coincidence. It was seen as confirmation. Like the repetition itself made it undeniable. See, everyone's saying the same thing. Yeah, because nobody's asking different questions. Nobody's digging deeper. Nobody's challenging the narrative or wondering why it sounds so consistent despite coming from completely different people. Because consistency feels safe. It feels reliable. It gives the illusion of accuracy. But all it really proves is how easily people fall into the same pattern of thinking. Because it's easier to agree than to think independently. Easier to repeat than to question. Easier to fit someone into an existing story than to build a new one from scratch. So they kept repeating it, over and over, until it stopped sounding like an opinion and started sounding like a fact. Until even the people who weren't sure began to nod along, not wanting to be the one voice that disagreed. And just like that, your identity was decided. Not by truth, not by depth, but by repetition. A chorus of voices. Each one slightly different, but all saying the same thing, reinforcing each other, strengthening a version of you that was never fully real to begin with. Understanding you would have taken effort, real effort. The kind that makes people uncomfortable. The kind that forces them to question their own thinking, their own assumptions, their own neat little version of how the world works. But labels are easy. You do one thing they don't like, suddenly. You're that kind of person. You react in a way they don't expect now, you're unstable. You choose a different path, refuse to follow the script they're comfortable with. Now you're difficult. The one word, and they're done with you. No need to ask questions. No need to look deeper. No need to figure out what led you there, what shaped you, what forced you into making the choices you made. Because a label, it wraps everything up nicely. It turns complexity into simplicity, chaos into something manageable. And people love manageable. They don't want to deal with contradictions. They don't want to accept that someone can be strong and broken at the same time, calm and dangerous, silent but aware. That kind of depth, it doesn't fit into their neat little categories. So they shrink you. They take everything you are, everything you've been through, everything you're capable of, and compress it into a single word they can understand. A word they can repeat. A word they can use to explain you without ever actually knowing you. Because once you've been labeled, they don't have to think anymore. That's the real comfort. Thinking requires doubt. It requires curiosity. It requires admitting that you might not have the full picture. And most people, they don't like that feeling. It makes them feel uncertain, exposed. Like they don't have control over their own understanding. So instead, they choose certainty. Even if it's fake. Even if it's built on half-truths, misunderstandings, and moments taken out of context. As long as it feels solid, as long as it gives them something they can point to and say, that's who you are, they'll hold on to it, tight. And once that label sticks, Everything you do starts to revolve around it. You try to explain yourself, they hear excuses. You try to change, they call it an act. You stay silent, they say it proves them right. No matter what you do, it all gets filtered through the same word they chose for you. The same box they put you in. The same narrow perspective they refuse to step outside of. Because stepping outside means admitting they were wrong. And that's something most people will avoid at all costs. It's easier to keep you small than to expand their understanding. Easier to reduce you to something predictable than to accept that you're constantly evolving, constantly shifting, constantly becoming something they can't easily define. So they stick with the label, repeat it, reinforce it, pass it around like it's fact, like it's something that was proven instead of something that was assumed. And the more it spreads, the harder it becomes to break. Because now it's not just one person's opinion. It's everyone's. And when everyone believes something, nobody feels the need to question it anymore. So they don't. They don't look beyond it. They don't reconsider. They don't pause and think, maybe there's more here than I understand. They just see the label and stop there. Control, that's what this was always about. Not truth, not understanding, control. Because the moment you stopped behaving the way they expected, the moment you stepped outside their little script and started thinking, moving, reacting on your own terms, something shifted. You became unpredictable, and unpredictable things make people nervous. They like patterns. They like knowing how someone will respond, what they'll say, where they'll stand. It gives them a sense of stability, a sense of power. But you broke that pattern. One day you stayed quiet, the next you spoke with intensity. One moment you walked away, the next you stood your ground. There was no clear formula, no easy way to map you out. And that bothered them. Because if they can't predict you, they can't control you. So they tried to understand you, not out of curiosity, but out of necessity. They observed, analyzed, discussed, trying to find some kind of weakness, some kind of pattern they could rely on, something that would bring you back into a space they felt comfortable with. But every time they thought they figured you out, you changed. Not randomly, but naturally. Because you're not static. You evolve. You adapt. You learn from every situation, every mistake, every moment that forced you to grow. And growth, it doesn't follow a predictable path. It shifts. It disrupts. It refuses to stay within boundaries. And that's exactly what they couldn't handle. Because when someone grows beyond your expectations, beyond your understanding, it forces you to confront your own limitations. It forces you to realize that maybe you don't have as much control as you thought you did, and people hate that realization. So instead of accepting your growth, they tried to contain it. They started defining you, labeling you, reducing you to something fixed, something unchanging, something they could keep within their mental grasp. Because if they can convince themselves that you're just that kind of person, then they don't have to deal with the reality that you're something more, something evolving, something they can't keep up with. They watched you make decisions they didn't understand and called it recklessness. They saw you walk paths they were too afraid to take and called it foolishness. They saw you detach from things that no longer served you and called it coldness. Not because those labels were accurate, but because they made you easier to handle. Because if you're just reckless, they can dismiss you. If you're just foolish, they can ignore you. If you're just cold, they can distance themselves from you without questioning their own discomfort. It simplifies everything. It brings you back into a box they can manage. But deep down beneath all those labels, beneath all those assumptions, there's something else. Something they don't say out loud. Fear. Not the loud, obvious kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that sits in the back of the mind and whispers uncomfortable truths. The kind that makes people uneasy without them fully understanding why. Because you remind them of something. Of what happens when someone stops following the rules they've accepted. Of what it looks like to move without needing approval, to think without needing validation, to act without being confined by expectations. And that kind of freedom, it's dangerous. Not because it harms anyone, but because it exposes how controlled everyone else really is. So they try to bring you back down, back into something familiar, something predictable, something they can explain away instead of confronting. Because as long as they can define you, they don't have to face what they can't control. They didn't build their conclusions on truth. They built them on fragments. Pieces of moments, half-seen reactions, incomplete stories stitched together, just well enough to look convincing from a distance. It looks solid at first glance. That's the dangerous part. Because when something feels complete, people stop questioning it. They don't look for what's missing. They don't ask what was left out. They just accept it. And that's exactly what happened with you. They took one moment and stretched it across your entire character. They took one reaction and treated it like your natural state. They took one decision and used it to explain every move you've ever made. No context, no depth, no understanding of what led to it or what came after. Just assumptions. And assumptions, they're quiet. They don't announce themselves as guesses. They present themselves like facts, like something already proven, already confirmed. That's how they slip into people's minds so easily. Because nobody stops to say, wait, is this actually true? They just nod. They just accept. They just add it to the growing pile of things they think they know about you. And the more those assumptions stack up, the more convincing the illusion becomes. It starts to look like a complete picture, like something carefully constructed and well thought out. But in reality, it's just layers of misunderstanding built on top of each other, a structure with no real foundation. They never saw the pressure you were under when you made that decision. They never understood the mindset you were in when you reacted the way you did. They never felt the weight of everything you were carrying behind the scenes. Because assumptions don't require empathy. They don't require effort. They don't require stepping into someone else's reality. They just require observation and a willingness to jump to conclusions. And people are very good at that. They see what's visible and fill in the rest with whatever makes sense to them. Not to you, not to the truth, but to them. Their perspective, their experiences, their limited understanding of how things should work. So when you don't fit that understanding, they adjust the story, not themselves. They don't question whether their view is incomplete. They don't consider the possibility that they're missing something important. Instead, they reshape you in their minds until you make sense within their narrow frame of reference. Even if that version of you is completely wrong. Because being wrong, that would mean they misjudged you. It would mean their observations weren't as accurate as they believed. It would mean they made a decision about you without having all the information. And that's not something most people are willing to admit. So they double down. They reinforce the assumptions, repeat them, share them with others like they're facts, like their conclusions reached through careful analysis instead of quick judgment. And the more they repeat them, the harder it becomes to separate assumption from reality, until eventually, nobody remembers where it started. Nobody remembers that it was just a guess. It becomes something else, something accepted, something known, and you're left standing in the middle of it, surrounded by conclusions that were never truly yours, defined by moments that were never fully understood, judged by a version of yourself that was created from pieces, not the whole, a version built not from who you are, but from what they assumed you to be. They thought your difference was a flaw, something to fix, something to point at, something to quietly warn others about. Like you were some kind of anomaly that didn't quite fit the system they were comfortable with. And maybe you didn't, but that was never the weakness they made it out to be. It just made you harder to understand. You didn't react the way they expected. You didn't follow the patterns they were used to. You didn't bend the same way others did when pressure was applied. And instead of seeing that as strength, they labeled it as a problem. Because different makes people uncomfortable. It disrupts their sense of normal. It challenges their assumptions about how people should think, act, respond. And when something challenges that, the easiest response isn't curiosity, it's rejection. So they pushed back. They questioned your choices, your mindset, your way of seeing things. Not because it was wrong, but because it wasn't familiar. And unfamiliar things, they feel dangerous to people who rely on predictability to feel in control. You didn't need their approval to move. That alone made them uneasy. You made decisions without asking for permission, spoke truths that didn't align with their version of reality, walked paths they wouldn't dare to step on. And every time you did, it created distance. Not because you were separating yourself, but because they couldn't follow. They didn't understand how you could keep going without validation, how you could stand alone without breaking, how you could take hits, real hits, and still move forward without turning into something soft, something easy, something manageable. That's not normal to them. Normal people adjust. They blend in. They soften their edges to fit into spaces that were never built for them. They sacrifice parts of themselves just to avoid standing out too much. You didn't. And that's where the problem started. Because when someone refuses to shrink, it forces everyone else to notice how much they already have. When someone stands firm in who they are, it exposes how easily others fold under pressure. When someone embraces what makes them different, it highlights how afraid others are to do the same. And that kind of contrast, it's uncomfortable. So they tried to convince you that your difference was wrong. That you needed to change, to adapt, to become something more acceptable. Not for your sake, but for theirs, so they wouldn't have to question why they chose comfort over growth. But you didn't fold, even when it cost you, even when it isolated you, even when it would have been easier to just blend in and disappear into the background like everyone else. You held on to that difference, even when they tried to turn it into something negative. Because deep down, whether they admit it or not, that's the part of you they can't ignore. That's the part they talk about when you're not around, the part that doesn't fit into their neat little explanations, the part that doesn't break the way they expect it to. It's unpredictable, uncontrollable, real. And that's exactly why they tried so hard